Some names and details in this story have been changed for the purpose of anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photos were taken at the scene. On September 13th, 2016, at 5 o'clock 40 minutes in the morning, truck driver Sam Barnes was driving down Highway 21 through the thick fog of Boxley Valley, Arkansas. His headlights caught a lone figure on the side of the road, moving unnaturally slowly, barely shifting his feet. It was a woman dressed in dirty men's overalls that were several sizes too big for her. When Sam ran up to her, he saw that her face was covered with old scars and fresh bruises, and her eyes were staring into space. But the real horror gripped the driver when the stranger opened her mouth, trying to say something. Instead of the usual smile, a chaotic palisade of yellow, rotten, obviously foreign teeth, roughly embedded in inflamed gums, stared back at him. It was Mary Lewis, who disappeared without a trace into the woods 5 months ago, and she had returned from the darkness to tell a chilling story. The story of the disappearance in the Ozark forests dates back to April 14, 2016. On this day, at 7:30 in the morning, a dark green Jeep Wrangler SUV pulled into the gravel parking lot at the beginning of the Compton Trailhead hiking trail. Behind the wheel was 27-year-old Fred Miller, a professional guide and experienced amateur caver who knew these woods better than most local rangers. In the passenger seat was his client, Mary Lewis, also 27 years old, a talented landscape photographer who had come here for one specific purpose. Mary Lewis was planning a series of photographs of rare wild orchids that bloom only a few days a year in a remote part of Buffalo National River National Park. She was interested in the area near Hampden Hollow Falls, the highest waterfall between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians. This place is famous for its wild beauty and dangerous terrain, where mobile communication disappears after a mile from the highway. Preparations for the expedition were documented. The day before the departure, on April 13, 2016, the surveillance cameras of the Ozark Outfitters store in Jasper recorded the couple at 18 hours and 15 minutes. Sales associate Thomas Reed later testified to police that the young men appeared focused and businesslike. According to a receipt later found in the store's archives, Fred Miller purchased a week's supply of freeze-dried food, 2 new gas cylinders for the burner, and 50 feet of strong climbing rope. According to the plan that Fred left with his sister Sarah Miller, the group was supposed to return to civilization on April 18th, no later than 6 in the evening. However, there was no call at the appointed time. Sarah Miller tried to contact her brother at 7, 8, and 10 in the evening, but Fred's phone was out of range. On April 19th at 8 in the morning, Sarah officially filed a missing persons report with the Newton County Sheriff's Office. The response from law enforcement was immediate. At 11 o'clock in the morning, a patrol team found Fred Miller's Jeep Wrangler in the same Compton Trailhead parking lot where he was last seen. The vehicle was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. An inspection of the interior through the glass showed the presence of wallets, documents, and a change of clothes, indicating that the tourists intended to return to the car. The search operation began at dawn on April 20th. It became one of the largest in the history of the district. More than 40 volunteers, professional National Park Service rangers, and dog teams were involved in the search. The 15-mile radius area was divided into squares. The teams combed through the dense brush, checking the many sinkholes and rock canopies that abound in this part of Arkansas. The weather, which had initially been favorable to the search, deteriorated sharply on April 21st. Heavy rains began to fall, turning the slopes into slippery mudslides and making aviation operations much more difficult. The state police helicopter was able to make only a few flights before low clouds forced the pilots to return to base. A key moment in the search occurred on April 23rd. A canine team led by Sergeant David Garcia was working on the eastern slope of the canyon, not far from the group's presumed route. The tracking dog, a bloodhound named Barney, picked up a clear trail that led from the main trail deep into the forest to a wild and uninhabited area. The trail led through dense undergrowth, avoiding safe descents, right to the edge of a high limestone cliff above the Buffalo River. But at the very edge of the cliff, the dog stopped. Barney circled in place, whining and refusing to go any further, even though there was no sign of bodies or equipment falling down by the river. Sergeant Garcia noted in his report that the trail ended suddenly, as if the people had simply vanished into thin air or taken off. No trace of another person or vehicle was found nearby. On April the 28th, 2016, after 2 weeks of fruitless efforts, the active phase of the search operation was curtailed. The official version of the investigation was an accident. In his final report, the head of the search team suggested that Fred and Mary could have fallen into one of the hidden vertical caves, the entrances to which are often disguised by dense vegetation and cannot be seen from the air. The relatives of the missing refused to believe in the accident version. They hired a private detective who spent another month interviewing locals and tourists who visited the park on those dates. None of the witnesses saw Fred and Mary after they entered the forest on April 14th. The forest swallowed them up without a trace, leaving only the locked Jeep in the parking lot and the cold silence of the mountains. The only clue the volunteers found after the search was officially over was a strange object stuck in a tree crevice half a mile from where the dogs had lost their trail. It was a piece of a camera strap that had been cut off with a sharp blade. The silence that had enveloped the case of the tourist's disappearance was broken on September 13th, 2016. Exactly 5 months had passed since the young couple had entered the forest and never returned. Hopes of finding them alive had long since turned into a statistical error, and the posters with their faces on bulletin boards had faded under the scorching Arkansas sun. However, that foggy Tuesday forever changed the course of the investigation, turning the tragedy into a horror movie. At 5:40 in the morning, logging truck driver Samuel Barnes was driving along winding Highway 21 through the Boxley Valley. Visibility was minimal, as the thick morning fog typical of this lowland covered the road in a dense veil. Barnes, who had been driving this route for more than 20 years, knew every turn, so he immediately noticed an anomaly on the side of the road. In the headlights, a shaky figure appeared, moving toward the road in an unnatural, broken gait. According to the driver's testimony, recorded by the patrol officer later, at first he thought it was a wounded animal or a drunken hunter. But when he slowed down and jumped out of the cab, he saw a picture that made him numb. It was a woman, but it was hard to recognize her as a person. She was dressed in a dirty, grease and dirt-soaked men's work overalls that were at least 4 sizes too big for her. The legs dragged on the asphalt, and the sleeves were roughly rolled up. The woman stopped when she saw the headlights, but did not attempt to cover her eyes with her hands. She just stood there and looked through the driver with a glassy stare. Barnes noted in the report that she had a heavy odor of damp earth, mold, and unwashed body odor. She was critically emaciated. Her skin was so tight around her cheekbones that her face resembled a skull covered in parchment. Numerous abrasions, insect bite marks, and old scars that had already begun to heal were visible on the exposed skin. The driver immediately called the rescue service and the police. Newton County Sheriff's Deputy Lieutenant Mark Dawson was the first to arrive. He tried to make contact with the unknown woman, but she did not respond to his questions. She was in a state of deep shock. When the lieutenant shone his flashlight on her face, he noticed a distinctive mole above her left eyebrow and a scar on her chin. After checking the description against the 5-month-old APB, the officer radioed in a confirmation code. The person found was tentatively identified as Mary Lewis. Fred Miller was not there. The woman was alone. The victim was rushed to Washington Regional Medical Center in Fayetteville. At 7:20 in the morning, she was taken to the intensive care unit. The doctor on duty, Dr. James Corder, who conducted the initial examination, later described her condition as critical. The patient's weight was only 85 pounds, indicating a loss of almost a third of her body weight. The diagnosis included severe dehydration, anemia, and signs of prolonged physical inactivity. Her leg muscles were so atrophied that every step was incredibly painful. Mary was conscious, but her mental state was classified as acute catatonic stupor. She did not make a single sound. Her eyes were unfocused, and her body occasionally shuddered with convulsions. However, the true extent of the horror was revealed when the medical team began a detailed examination of her head and neck. The woman's face showed signs of long-standing but severe injuries. Her nose was deformed due to an improperly fused fracture, and her cheekbones showed dark bruises. Dr. Corder asked his assistant to gently open the patient's mouth to check the airway and mucous membrane. When the light of the medical lamp fell inside the mouth, the examination room fell dead silent. The medical report that morning contained details that shocked even experienced investigators. Most of Mary Lewis's own teeth were missing. The nature of the damage to the gums and root fragments indicated that the teeth had been knocked out or broken using brute force. The experts concluded that the blows were inflicted with a heavy blunt object, probably a rifle butt or the handle of a massive tool, and the blows were deliberate. But the void in the mouth was filled. In place of the knocked-out incisors and molars, other people's teeth were mounted in the gums. It was a barbaric, artisanal implantation. Foreign objects were driven into living tissue or fixed with a gray substance that resembled construction or industrial cement. The implanted teeth were strikingly different from the young woman's natural teeth. They were yellow, darkened by time, and some had chips and deep cracks. An X-ray of the skull taken at 8 o'clock in the morning showed that these implants had nothing to do with modern dentistry. They were installed chaotically, without observing the anatomical order. Molars in place of incisors, canines in place of premolars. Mary's tongue was severely injured against the sharp edges of these fragments, turning into a continuous wound, making speech physically impossible, even if she wanted to speak. Police detectives who arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock seized Mary's clothes for examination. The men's overalls were saturated with the smell of diesel fuel and old dampness typical of basement rooms. Nothing was found in the pockets, except dust and a few dried breadcrumbs. Mary herself did not react to the presence of law enforcement officers. She lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, while doctors tried to ease her pain with strong analgesics. Dr. Corder requested an urgent consultation with a forensic dentist. A preliminary examination of the foreign teeth yielded a result that gave the case an even more sinister tone. The specialist noted that, judging by the degree of wear and characteristic darkening of the enamel, these teeth belonged to people much older than Mary. Moreover, anatomical differences indicated that these teeth were not taken from the same person. There was a monstrous collection in the girl's mouth that had belonged to at least 3 or 4 different individuals, and some of these teeth looked like they had been extracted posthumously many years ago. Friends, before we continue to dive into the darkest details of this gruesome case, I ask you to do one simple but important thing. Subscribe to the channel, leave any comment below this video, and like it. YouTube's algorithms work in such a way that your activity helps to promote this content so that Mary and Fred's story can be seen by as many people as possible. Your support allows us to continue these investigations. Thank you. And now we return to the events of September 2016. After the shocking discovery of Mary Lewis on Highway 21, the investigation instantly changed its vector. The missing persons case was officially reclassified as a criminal investigation into kidnapping, illegal imprisonment, and torture with particular cruelty. The investigative team was led by Detective Robert Harrison, a veteran Newton County police officer who realized that time was running out. While doctors fought for Mary's physical survival, forensic scientists tried to decipher the horrific message left in her body by the perpetrator. On September 20, 2016, a report from the state's leading dental forensic scientist, Dr. Alan Grant, landed on the detective's desk. The document contained conclusions that made even experienced operatives feel cold horror. The examination confirmed that the foreign objects implanted in the victim's jaw were real human teeth. But the most frightening thing was their origin. Dr. Grant found that these teeth did not belong to one person. It was a chaotic set, collected from at least 5 different donors. Analysis of the enamel and root canals revealed a striking detail. The biological age of these teeth ranged from 30 to 60 years, but their actual age was much older. 2 of the molars showed traces of amalgam, the chemical composition of which corresponded to dental mixtures used in the late 19th or early 20th century. This meant that the teeth were not knocked out of fresh victims. They had been extracted from skulls that had been in the ground for tens, perhaps even hundreds of years. The criminal was not just mutilating people. He was a looter who opened old graves. While forensic scientists were working with the physical evidence, Detective Harrison tried to get a statement from Mary herself. It turned out to be an almost impossible task. The girl was in a state of deep dissociation. She could not speak not only because of physical injuries to her tongue and mouth, but also because of a severe psychological block. Clinical psychologist Sarah Taylor, who was assigned to the case, explained to investigators that the victim's psyche had shut down as a defense mechanism against the horror she had experienced. Attempts to establish written contact also failed. When the detective put a pen in Mary's hand and held a notebook up to her on September 22nd, she began to tremble uncontrollably. Her hand shook so badly that the pen fell out, and her heart rate spiked on the vital signs monitors. She could only answer simple questions by blinking slowly. Once. Yes. Twice. No. Or she would gently squeeze the doctor's hand. From these bits of information, it was possible to learn only that she was kept in the dark and could not see the face of her tormentor. In parallel with the work at the hospital, the investigation team returned to the Ozark forests. Focusing on the spot where the truck driver picked up Mary and analyzing soil samples from her clothing, the experts narrowed the search area. On September 25th, the search team came across an abandoned building in the dense forest of Newton County, 10 miles from the nearest paved road. It was an old hunting lodge that did not appear on any modern maps. The building looked as if it had been abandoned half a century ago. The roof had caved in, and the windows were boarded up with rotten boards. However, the door was reinforced with a new, heavy bolt. When the special forces broke down the door, there was no one inside, but the atmosphere in the room was saturated with the smell of suffering. The only room was empty, except for an old iron bed without a mattress chained to the wall. Leftover food and plastic water bottles were lying on the floor. But the main evidence came when the experts used luminol. In the darkness, the floor and walls glowed blue, indicating the presence of large amounts of washed-up blood. The samples were immediately sent to the laboratory. 24 hours later, confirmation came back that the blood belonged to Fred Miller. The nature of the spatter on the wall indicated that the blows had been delivered from the top down while the victim was lying down or sitting up. Fred's body was nowhere to be found. Investigators combed the woods within a mile radius of the cabin, checked the crawl space and attic, but found no sign of a burial site. Inspection of the cabin's walls revealed another detail that helped establish the chronology of events. On a wooden beam, about 3 feet from the floor, a date was scratched out with something sharp, presumably a nail or knife. April 15th. This was the day after the couple entered the forest. This meant that their hell began almost instantly, and that Fred Miller was alive at least during the first days of captivity. The absence of Fred's body and the empty cabin led the investigation to one disappointing conclusion. Fred Miller is most likely dead, and his body is safely hidden elsewhere. Mary Lewis had managed to escape or was released, but the criminal who had done it was still at large. He knew these woods better than anyone, knew how to go unnoticed, and had a specific, sadistic interest in anatomy and antiquity. While the police were inspecting the empty torture chamber, Detective Harrison noticed a strange object on the dusty windowsill, a small, perfectly polished bone amulet that clearly belonged to neither Mary nor Fred. On September 28, 2016, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere reigned in the Newton County Sheriff's Office. On a large corkboard, connected by red threads, hung photographs of Mary Lewis's disfigured face, pictures of an empty hunting lodge, and a map of the Ozark forest. Investigators had a profile of the perpetrator, drawn up by FBI behaviorists. He was a local man, a loner, perfectly oriented in the woods, with a penchant for sadism, trophy collecting, and specific, albeit distorted, medical skills. 3 people fit this description perfectly, and Detective Robert Harrison was sure that one of them was the ghost that had kidnapped the tourists. The first on the list of suspects was 52-year-old Elias Cobb, known locally as Dirty Elias. Cobb was a professional poacher and illegal ginseng collector who knew every trail within a 50-mile radius of Hamadon Hollow Falls. He already had a criminal record for armed assault and resisting arrest. Moreover, rangers reported seeing his pickup truck in the area where the tourists disappeared in April. The operation to arrest Cobb took place on September 29 at 5 o'clock in the morning. A takedown team surrounded his trailer, which was parked on a remote spot by the river. Cobb did not resist, although he was drunk. When detectives searched his home, they found a box of strange amulets made of small animal bones, feathers, and wire. It resonated with the bone amulet found in the torture chamber. It seemed like the puzzle had been solved. However, during the interrogation, Cobb only laughed in the investigators' faces. When Harrison named the date of the disappearance, April 14, 2016, the suspect advised checking the police archives of the neighboring county. The alibi check was a cold shower for the investigation. On April 14th, the day Fred and Mary entered the woods, Elias Cobb started a massive brawl at the Rusty Neil Bar 30 miles away. The police report recorded his arrest at 18 hours and 30 minutes. He spent the next 15 days in a pretrial detention center, which made it impossible to implicate him in the kidnapping and initial torture. After the failure with Cobb, the investigation turned its attention to suspect number 2. He was 45-year-old Marcus Vance, a former dentist who had been disbarred 5 years earlier for systematic drug use on the job. Vance lived as a hermit in an old trailer near the village of Ponca. His candidacy looked the most promising because of the specific nature of Mary's injuries. Who else but a former dentist could have performed such a complex, albeit barbaric, procedure of implanting someone else's teeth? On October 2nd, the detectives obtained a search warrant for Vance's home. The trailer was littered with trash and medical reference books, but no dental instruments were found. Vance himself looked confused and sick. When he was asked about his whereabouts in the spring, he provided documents that again destroyed the investigation's theory. According to the extracts from the private drug treatment clinic New Way in Little Rock, Marcus Vance was hospitalized on April 1, 2016, in serious condition after an overdose. He was inpatiently treated in a closed, high-security ward until June 1st. His phone billing data confirmed that the device did not leave the clinic during the entire 2 months when Mary and Fred were being tortured in the woods. Vance could not have been physically in the Ozarks during that time. The third possibility was less exotic, but statistically the most likely: an ex-partner. Mary's ex-boyfriend, a 30-something architect, had a history of stalking. Mary's friends said that he threatened her on the eve of the trip, jealous of her career and travel. On October 5th, he was summoned for questioning. The man behaved arrogantly, but provided ironclad evidence of his innocence. His passport contained border-crossing stamps. On April 10th, he flew to Germany on a business trip and returned to the United States only on May 5th. The employer provided timesheets and photos from a conference in Berlin dated the days of the tragedy. Technical forensics of his computer and phone also revealed no connections to the Ozark region during the critical period. By mid-October, the investigation was at a dead end. The 3 ideal suspects were in the clear. The investigative team spent dozens of hours reviewing old disappearance cases, checking with remote landowners, and interviewing local hunters. But the forest was silent. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints in the cabin, no tire tracks other than those of the victim. Detective Harrison felt that they were missing something important, something that was on the surface. The perpetrator was not a visiting maniac, nor was he a random drifter. He acted methodically, had access to resources, premises, and specific materials. He felt like a master in these mountains. But while the police were going through the papers in their offices, something happened in the Ozark forests that was to turn the case upside down. A group of hikers, who had wandered off a marked trail in search of adventure, came across a strange object that looked as if it had been deliberately put on display. On October 15, 2016, the forest silence of the Ozarks was once again disturbed, but this time not by cries for help, but by a chance discovery that seemed too perfect to be true. At 10 o'clock, 40 minutes in the morning, a couple of amateur birders from Kansas City, who had strayed from the marked route in search of a rare species of woodpecker, came across a strange object in the forest thicket. It happened 5 miles east of where Mary Lewis was found barely alive a month earlier. Under a century-old oak tree among the fallen leaves and wild shrubbery was a hiking backpack. It had not been abandoned in a hurry and was not lying in the dirt. The backpack stood upright, neatly leaning against the tree trunk, like a museum piece or an ominous road sign. Detective Robert Harrison, who arrived at the scene, immediately recognized the equipment. It was a navy blue Osprey backpack, identical to the one Fred Miller was wearing on the day he disappeared. But the condition of the item raised suspicions. After 6 months in the wild forest, the fabric should have faded, become moldy, or been damaged by rodents. The same backpack looked as if it had been taken out of an airtight closet only yesterday. The forensic team opened the flap of the backpack on the spot, recording every action on a video camera. The contents were standard for a tour guide: a laminated map of the area, a compass, a folding knife. But in the side pocket, wrapped in a transparent plastic bag with a clasp, was an object that made the operatives flinch. It was a human tooth, a small primary premolar with a long, bloody root. Later, DNA testing confirmed that the tooth belonged to Mary Lewis and had been forcibly removed from her mouth. It looked like an outright mockery, a message from the perpetrator that he was in control of the situation and was playing with the police. Laboratory analysis of the backpack's surface, conducted on October 16th, yielded two key markers. Traces of low-purity technical grease used to lubricate heavy machinery were found on the straps and rubbed in dirt with a specific red-brown hue on the bottom. The state geologist consulted identified the sample as a clay with a high iron oxide content, typical of the abandoned zinc mine area in the Black Bear sector 7 miles to the north. This information instantly narrowed the search. Police knew that a 40-year-old homeless man and drug addict named Thomas Jebson had been living in the Black Bear old mine system for several years. Jebson had a long list of priors for petty theft and trespassing. Combined with the grease and clay on his backpack, this made him an ideal suspect. The raid was scheduled for October 18th. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a combined team of special forces and detectives surrounded the entrance to the mine. The operation took place in a highly dangerous environment. The old tunnels could collapse at any moment, and the suspect could be armed. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the light of the tactical flashlights picked out rusted trolleys and rotten fasteners. 300 feet from the entrance, the group discovered a makeshift camp. On a pile of dirty rags lay the body of a man. It was Thomas Jebson. He was dead. A used syringe was sticking out of his left arm, and his skin had already acquired a characteristic waxy tint. The forensic physician who examined the body on the spot stated that death had occurred approximately 3 days ago. That is, on October 15th, the very day the tourists found the backpack. The cause of death was a massive heroin overdose. During the search of Jebson's home, police found several items that seemed to finally close the case. In the corner was a flashlight of the same model that Fred Miller had bought, and a roll of climbing rope. The county police chief was ready to call a press conference. The story seemed logical and convenient. A maniacal drug addict kidnapped the couple, killed the boy, tortured the girl in his madness, and then, unable to bear the remorse or fear of exposure, killed himself. The next day, October 19th, local newspapers were already preparing headlines about the monster of the mine. But Detective Harrison did not share the general enthusiasm. Returning to the morgue, he once again carefully examined the hands of the dead Jebson. The vagrant's fingers were rough, with dirt embedded under the nails and traces of numerous injections. But most importantly, he had a long-standing tremor, typical of long-term drug addicts. Harrison recalled the horrific but jewelry-like precision with which someone else's teeth were fitted into Mary Lewis's jaw. This procedure, in addition to cruelty, required a steady hand, special tools, and most importantly, specific medical or industrial cement. Nothing of the sort was found in Jebson's mine. No pliers, no mortar, no collection of old teeth. Jebson could barely hold a spoon, let alone perform a complex surgical procedure. The detectives' doubts turned to confidence when the extended chemical analysis results of the red clay from the backpack came back in the evening of the same day. The geologist, Dr. Thorne, sent an urgent message. The clay on Fred's backpack visually resembled the soil from the Jebson mine, but chemically, they were completely different substances. The sample from the backpack contained microparticles of limestone dust and diesel fuel impurities that are not found in natural deposits at the Black Bear mine. This composition was not typical for an abandoned adit, but for an active quarry or a place of active excavation where heavy machinery is used. The crime scene changed dramatically. The backpack was neither lost nor hidden. It was on display. Thomas Jebsen was not the killer. He was just another victim, a convenient scapegoat used to lead the police on a false trail. The real predator sacrificed a pawn to buy time. He was smarter than they thought, and he was still on the loose, watching the police rejoice in the solving of the case. Detective Harrison realized that the only clue was the same specific clay and symbol that Mary had been trying to draw. On October 20th, 2016, in the sterile silence of the intensive care unit of the Regional Medical Center, an event occurred that finally tore the mask off the unknown sadist. Mary Lewis's condition stabilized so much that doctors allowed detectives to conduct a short session. The girl was still unable to speak because of the horrific injuries to her tongue and the foreign structures in her jaw, but her consciousness was clear. Psychologist Sarah Taylor, who stayed at the patient's bedside, noticed that Mary was trying to show something with gestures, imitating the movements of drawing. Detective Robert Harrison put a soft pencil in her weak, still trembling hand and brought a hard-backed notebook to her. Mary closed her eyes, gathering her strength, and began to move the stylus across the paper. These were not letters or words. The lines were uneven, broken, but with each stroke the image became clearer. She drew a circle, and inside it, two crossed objects with long handles and massive tops. These were not just tools, but specific geological hammers with a flat striker on one side and a pointed beak on the other. When Mary finished the drawing and dropped the pencil in helplessness, Detective Harrison felt his blood run cold. He didn't need to send this image to the FBI database or look it up on the internet. He had seen the symbol hundreds of times. It was plastered on the sides of trucks hauling gravel on county roads. It hung on billboards along the highway, and it was even engraved on a plaque in the lobby of City Hall. It was the official emblem of the Ozark Stone and Excavating Company, a small but highly respected construction firm. The owner of this company was 50-year-old Arthur Blake. For the people of Jasper and the entire Newton County, this name was synonymous with reliability and integrity. Arthur Blake was considered a pillar of local society, an exemplary family man, father of 2 daughters, deacon in the local church, and generous philanthropist. But the most horrifying thing about this discovery was his role in the events of April 2016. Harrison pulled up the archives of the search operation and read the reports with horror. Arthur Blake was not just a witness. He was one of the most active participants in the search for Fred and Mary. In the first days after the disappearance, he provided the volunteers with 3 of his own powerful ATVs to comb through the hard-to-reach areas of the forest. He personally brought hot coffee and food for the rangers, coordinated groups of volunteers, and even drove dog handlers in his SUV to the very sectors where the detective now realized he could be hiding evidence. He was at the center of the action, monitoring every move the police made, listening to radio conversations and steering the search in the wrong direction, with a caring smile on his face. Back at the station, Harrison began to dig deeper, and Arthur Blake's impeccable facade began to crack. Interviews with former employees of his firm and neighbors revealed a dark side to his life that only a select few knew about. It turned out that Blake had a specific hobby that bordered on obsession. He was a fanatical black archaeologist. Every weekend, instead of hunting or fishing, Blake would take a professional metal detector, ground-penetrating radar, and a set of tools, and disappear into the woods. He was not just interested in coins or shell casings. He was obsessed with Civil War history, especially the forgotten battles in the Ozark Mountains and the sites of old settlements of the early 19th century colonists. The former foreman of his company said that Blake often bragged about his finds: Confederate buckles, buttons, and personal belongings of soldiers. But there were rumors that he had found something more: forgotten, unmarked graves that he dug up without any permits or remorse. This information became the key that unlocked the worst secret of the case. The detective recalled the conclusion of a forensic dentist, Dr. Grant, regarding the teeth inserted into Mary Lewis's jaw. The examination claimed that the teeth belonged to people who had died more than 100 years ago and bore traces of 19th century amalgam treatment. Now everything fell into place. The yellow, rotten fragments in the victim's mouth were not random debris. They were Arthur Blake's trophies. The picture of the crime formed a single, terrifying puzzle. Blake did not just find and dig up the remains of soldiers and settlers. He kept their teeth as part of his morbid collection. When he mutilated Mary, his psychopathy, steeped in perfectionism and obsession with history, led him to restore a living person the same way he restored old jugs or weapons. He used parts of dead people from the last century to fill the void he had created with his hammer. On October 21st, the detectives received another confirmation. The laboratory completed a comparative analysis of the red clay from Fred Miller's backpack, found in the woods, and soil samples from various industrial sites in the county. The unique chemical composition of the clay, with impurities of diesel fuel and limestone dust, matched perfectly with samples taken from a private limestone quarry owned by the Ozark Stone Company. Now the police had not just a profile, but a specific name, motive, and evidence. Arthur Blake, the man who shook hands with the sheriff and consoled the relatives of the missing, was the very monster who had made the young couple's lives hell. He felt completely unpunished, protected by his reputation and money. But as the takedown team began to prepare to leave, the officer on duty delivered disturbing news. According to traffic cameras, Blake's massive pickup truck had turned off the highway half an hour earlier onto an old dirt road leading directly to the very quarry where the clay was as red as blood. The operation to detain Arthur Blake and search the Ozark Stone properties began on October 22, 2016, at 16 o'clock sharp. It was a coordinated action involving 3 SWAT teams, homicide detectives, and the state's K-9 unit. The arrest warrant was issued based on a combination of evidence: the chemical composition of the clay from the victim's backpack, and the victim's recognition of the company's logo. Law enforcement officials realized that they were dealing not just with a killer, but with an influential person who had been leading the investigation by the nose for months. The first group went to an old limestone quarry located in a remote part of the county, where only dirt service roads led. It was here that geological exploration revealed the same type of red clay that had contaminated Fred Miller's belongings. The quarry was officially closed to mining 5 years ago, but was used by Blake's company as a warehouse for decommissioned equipment and construction debris. The area looked like a Martian landscape: rusty excavators, mountains of rubble, and deep pits filled with rainwater. Dog handlers began combing the sector where, according to satellite images, excavation work had recently been carried out. The dogs, trained to search for human remains, almost immediately showed concern near the southern wall of the quarry. There, among the pile of concrete slabs and rebar, was one block that was different from the others. It looked fresher, and its shape was atypical of standard building structures. It was a 4 by 4 foot monolithic cube, carelessly poured with concrete. When the operators brought in a hydraulic hammer and began to carefully break the concrete, the air was filled with a heavy smell of decomposition that penetrated even the stone. At 18 hours and 30 minutes, the experts freed the man's body from the concrete captivity. Despite the severe changes, the clothes and personal belongings allowed them to preliminarily identify the deceased as Fred Miller. His hands were tied behind his back with wire, and his skull was crushed by a powerful blow. The nature of the wound perfectly matched the shape of the striking part of a geological hammer, the same tool that was depicted on the emblem of Blake's company. In parallel with the work at the quarry, the second assault team entered the Ozark Stone headquarters in Jasper. Arthur Blake was in his office on the second floor. When the armed officers kicked in the door, he was sitting at his massive mahogany desk, calmly polishing an antique bronze buckle. He did not resist, did not try to escape or make excuses. A mask of cold indifference was frozen on his face, as if he had been waiting for this moment. During the search of the office, detectives found evidence that turned conjecture into fact. On one of the shelves, among the collectible Civil War revolvers and antique surgical instruments, were items that Blake did not even try to hide. There was a glass jar of medical polymer cement identical to the one found in Mary Lewis's mouth. Next to it were specialized 19th-century dental pliers with traces of dried blood and small bone fragments. Investigators later reconstructed the full picture of the tragedy that occurred on April 14th. That morning, Fred and Mary, exploring the remote corners of the forest in search of orchids, accidentally stumbled upon the entrance to a hidden cave. There they found Arthur Blake at his illegal trade. He was uncovering a mass grave of Confederate soldiers that was not marked on maps. Blake had found a real treasure for a collector, and he didn't need witnesses. When Fred tried to intervene and shame the looter, Blake did not hesitate to hit him in the temple with a geological hammer. He died instantly. He left Mary alive, but not out of pity. She became the object of his sick obsession. When Blake hit the girl in the face with the same hammer in a fit of rage, knocking out her teeth and breaking her jaw, something switched in his psyche. A psychiatric profile later revealed that Blake suffered from a severe form of obsessive-compulsive disorder related to the idea of wholeness and restoration. He could not bear the sight of a broken thing, even if he had broken it himself. For him, Mary ceased to be a person and turned into a damaged exhibit that needed immediate repair. That is why he did not kill her immediately. He took her to the basement of his country house, which he converted into a workshop. There, using his monstrous collection of teeth unearthed from the graves of soldiers and early settlers, he carried out a series of barbaric operations. He tried to fix her smile by driving a dead bone into her living gums, guided only by the logic of symmetry and historical accuracy that he understood. For 5 months, he kept her in the dark, chained, fed through a tube, and admired his work, while she slowly went mad with pain and terror. As the detectives led Blake out of the office in handcuffs, he paused at the display case with his findings. His gaze slid over the old metals and bones. One of the officers asked him where the rest of Fred Miller's body was, hoping for a confession. Blake slowly turned his head, looked the detective straight in the eye, and quietly, in a completely casual tone, said a phrase that made even the hairs on the backs of Special Forces veterans stand up. "I am not destroying history, detective. I am preserving it. They are now part of eternity, and you can't change anything." The trial of Arthur Blake began on February 6, 2017, in the Newton County District Court. and instantly became the main topic for all the media in Arkansas. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electrifying. When the defendant was brought into the room, the relatives of the deceased Fred Miller and the journalists present stood in anticipation, trying to see at least a shadow of remorse on the face of the monster from the Ozarks. However, Blake looked completely calm, even detached, as if the events around him did not concern him. The defense team chose a predictable but risky strategy. They tried to convince the jury that their client was completely insane. Invited psychiatrists painted a portrait of a man whose mind was destroyed by a severe form of obsessive-compulsive disorder and a manic obsession with historical integrity. They argued that Blake was not in control of his actions when he killed and tortured, obeying a morbid impulse to fix the world. However, State's Attorney David Anderson methodically smashed this line of defense. He presented the court with evidence of cold, cynical calculation. Blake wasn't crazy when he planted the victim's backpack to send the police on a false trail. He was acting deliberately when he provided his equipment for the search and personally drove volunteers to the places where he hid evidence. On March 15, 2017, after 4 hours of deliberations, the jury announced the verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Arthur Blake to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Mary Lewis, this verdict was only the beginning of a long and painful journey back to life. Her physical rehabilitation lasted over 18 months. The most difficult stage was a series of unique maxillofacial surgeries at the Little Rock Clinic. The surgeons had to literally hollow out the fossilized teeth of the dead from her gums, which had grown into living tissue in 5 months. After that, Mary underwent a complicated bone grafting procedure. Doctors transplanted bone fragments from her own hip to restore the destroyed jaw structure and installed modern titanium implants. But while the bones fused, her soul remained crippled. Mary gave up photography forever. She sold all of her cameras and lenses, explaining to her mother that she would never again be able to look through the viewfinder at the forest, knowing that someone might be looking back at her from behind the trees. She changed her last name and moved to a small town on the coast, away from the mountains and caves, where she got a job in the city archives. The end of this story came on April 14, 2018, the second anniversary of the tragedy. Mary came to Arkansas for the last time to visit Fred Miller's grave in Jasper Cemetery. The day was overcast, with low clouds clinging to the treetops. Mary's mother, wanting to capture the moment of saying goodbye to the past, asked her daughter to stand by the tombstone and try to smile. Mary did as she was asked. The muscles of her face, reshaped by surgeons' scalpels, tensed. Her lips stretched, revealing perfectly straight, dazzling white artificial teeth. But in the photo that remains in the family album, this smile looks terribly unnatural. It's not an expression of joy or peace, but a taut, mechanical grimace of pain that has changed her face forever. The Ozark Mountains remain standing behind her, majestic, beautiful, and indifferent. They still hold hundreds of undiscovered caves and forgotten treasures in their depths, for which some people are willing to kill and others to die, leaving their secrets deep in the red clay.